courthouse was crowded and buzzing with tension. Everyone seemed to feel that something big was about to happen, even the people waiting quietly on the benches. The air was thick with anticipation. Some people whispered to each other, while others just stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the courtroom. Today was not a normal day. It was the day the trial of the controversial police officer would unfold. The officer had been accused of actions that had shocked the community. Many people believed he had crossed the line during his duties, and now the truth would finally come out in front of a judge and the public. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. The walls seemed to hold all the tension like they were listening to. Reporters were everywhere, some typing rapidly on their laptops, others scribbling notes by hand. Cameras were set up in corners, pointing at the main part of the courtroom where everything would happen. People had been waiting for this trial for months. Some wanted justice, others just wanted to see what would happen. The officer sat in the defendant's area, quiet but with a certain edge about him. He was not openly aggressive yet, but his body language suggested he was not at peace. His hands rested on the table, slightly shaking, and his eyes scanned the room continuously, as if he was trying to find a way to control everything. The judge entered the courtroom, and immediately, a hush fell over everyone. She had a reputation for being fair but firm. She walked slowly to her seat, her robe flowing behind her, and the sound of her steps seemed to echo in the tense room. As soon as she sat, she looked around the courtroom with calm authority. Everyone felt the weight of her gaze, and even the officers present straightened up. The trial began with formal introductions. The officer's defense attorney spoke first, presenting the case as one that had been misunderstood by the public. They suggested that some things had been blown out of proportion, and that the officer's actions were based on high-pressure situations that anyone in his position might face. The prosecution then took the floor. Their tone was different. They spoke with seriousness and determination, laying out the accusations clearly. They mentioned specific incidents where the officer's behavior had crossed legal and ethical lines. Witnesses were called one by one, each bringing new details. Some were civilians who had seen or been affected by the officer's actions. Others were colleagues who had witnessed situations from the inside. Each testimony added more weight to the case and slowly built a picture that made the courtroom even more tense. The officer listened quietly, but his jaw tightened with each statement. Every time the prosecution presented new evidence, his hands clenched slightly and his eyes darted around, searching for signs of weakness or support. Outside the courtroom, news of the trial had attracted attention from many different groups. Activists and community members had gathered, discussing what might happen. Some were hopeful that justice would be served. Others were skeptical, believing the officer might find a way to avoid accountability. The tension inside the courtroom was mirrored outside, where crowds gathered, hoping to hear the outcome through news reports and live streams. The courthouse had become a center of attention, a place where everyone's emotions were running high. Back inside, the officer's behavior began to change as the trial progressed. At first, he had remained composed, but now his frustration was starting to show. Small gestures revealed it. He shifted in his seat, tapped his fingers on the table, and occasionally muttered under his breath. His defense attorney tried to calm him, whispering words of reassurance, but the tension was visible to everyone who could see him. The judge noticed the change in demeanor and made a note to keep a close eye on him. She was experienced enough to sense when someone might act unpredictably, and she took mental notes of the officer's expressions and body language. Witness after witness spoke, each adding layers of detail to the case. The courtroom listened intently, some people leaning forward in their seats to catch every word. The officer's frustration grew, not just because of what was being said, but because of the reactions of the people around him. The audience's eyes seemed to pierce him, judging him silently. Some nodded in agreement with the witnesses, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Like a storm that had been building and could break at any moment, the first few hours of the trial passed slowly. Time seemed to stretch as the testimonies continued. The officer's face changed with every story told. At one moment, he looked defensive. The next, he seemed almost lost in thought, replaying the events in his mind. The judge maintained control of the courtroom, asking questions calmly and making sure the proceedings stayed orderly. She reminded the jury to pay attention to facts and evidence, not emotions. Even though it was clear that emotions were running high for everyone in the room, lunch was called, giving the courtroom a brief respite. People moved slowly, still absorbed in the tension of the morning. The officer remained seated, his eyes focused on nothing in particular, but his mind was clearly racing. The defense attorney spoke quietly to him, trying to reinforce a sense of control and strategy. Meanwhile, outside, the crowds discussed the morning's events, sharing their opinions and predictions. The story of this trial was spreading quickly. Many people were already forming strong opinions about what might happen. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was even more intense. Witnesses continued their testimonies, and the officer's agitation became more noticeable. He shifted constantly, his movements more restless. The judge noticed and calmly instructed him to remain seated and composed. Everyone sensed that something was building, a tension that could erupt if not managed carefully. The proceedings continued with a mix of fear, curiosity, and anticipation. The officer's frustration reached a point where it was no longer just internal. Small outbursts began to surface, a sharp tone in his voice when responding to questions, pointed glance at the prosecution, a muttered word that barely escaped his lips. The judge observed all of this closely, maintaining control and ensuring that the courtroom remained safe. She signaled subtly to the security officers present, who remained alert. Knowing that the situation required constant attention, by the end of the first day of the trial, it was clear that this was no ordinary case. The tension inside the courtroom and the attention outside created a charged atmosphere. The officer's behavior suggested that he might not remain calm if provoked, and everyone sensed that the coming days would be crucial. The judge's steady presence provided a sense of order, but the underlying storm hinted that unexpected events could happen at any time. The courthouse, filled with people, energy, and emotions, was now a stage for a story that would capture attention far beyond its walls. It was the beginning of a trial that everyone would remember, a story of tension, accountability, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The second day of the trial started with a quiet tension that was almost suffocating. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was still, but the unease was noticeable in small ways. People shifted in their seats, exchanged nervous glances, and some chewed their nails or tapped their fingers on the benches. The officer returned to the courtroom looking even more tense than the previous day. His eyes darted around the room constantly, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had spent the night thinking over what had happened yesterday and seemed to carry a mix of frustration and anxiety. The judge entered the courtroom, her presence immediately restoring some sense of order. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the room to make sure everyone was ready to proceed. Once she sat down, the proceedings began again. The prosecution started by bringing in more witnesses. This time, the people coming forward had seen events up close. They were not just reporting what they had heard or read in the news. They had experienced the situations firsthand. Their testimonies painted vivid pictures of the officers' actions and the impact they had on the community. The witnesses spoke clearly, their voices steady, but the emotion behind their words was impossible to ignore. Some choked back tears while recounting their experiences, and the jury listened intently. Absorbing every detail, the officer's defense attorney tried to calm him, whispering explanations and strategies quietly. The officer nodded occasionally, but barely listened. His mind seemed to be elsewhere, focused on the pressure and on the growing awareness that this trial could ruin his career. The courtroom felt smaller as the tension grew, and every movement or word seemed amplified. Every time a witness described an incident that involved him directly, the officer's body language changed. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened, and he leaned forward in his seat, as if trying to anticipate what would come next. It was clear that he was struggling to maintain control. Outside the courtroom, the media continued to cover the trial extensively. News crews broadcast live updates, and social media buzzed with opinions and speculation. People debated what might happen next, sharing videos, articles, and comments online. The story had captured the attention of the entire city, and many were invested in the outcome. Community members who could not be present in the courtroom followed the updates closely. feeling the weight of the trial as if they were part of it themselves. The tension inside the courtroom seemed to spill into the streets, creating a shared experience for everyone following the story. Inside, the witnesses continued to provide detailed accounts. Some described moments of fear and confusion, while others spoke of courage and resilience. Each testimony revealed different sides of the officer, creating a complex image that was difficult to ignore. The jury had to listen carefully, balancing the facts with their own understanding of right and wrong. The judge asked questions to clarify details, ensuring that the proceedings remained fair and focused. Her calm demeanor contrasted with the rising tension in the room, providing a sense of stability even as the officer's behavior became more erratic. The officer's agitation became increasingly visible. At times, he muttered under his breath, barely audible, but enough to make people notice. He shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the table, and occasionally shot sharp looks toward the prosecution. The judge observed all of this quietly but attentively, knowing that she needed to be prepared for any sudden moves. Security officers remained alert, subtly positioning themselves to respond quickly if the situation escalated. Everyone in the courtroom was aware that the officer's patience was wearing thin, and the possibility of an outburst hung in the air. As the day progressed, the officer's frustration seemed to peak. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, and occasionally clenched his fists. His defense attorney whispered advice, but the officer's responses were minimal, showing that he was lost in thought. The witnesses continued, each account adding more pressure and tension. The courtroom audience could feel the growing anxiety, and whispers spread like wildfire among those seated on the benches. People leaned forward to catch every word, sensing that something important was building toward a climax. During a break in the proceedings, the officer was observed speaking quietly to his attorney. Their conversation seemed intense, with the officer gesturing and nodding while the attorney responded calmly. It was clear that the officer was trying to process the information and plan his next move. Meanwhile, the judge took a moment to speak to the jury, reminding them to focus on facts and evidence and to remain impartial. The jury listened carefully, aware of the responsibility they carried and the seriousness of the trial. When the trial resumed, the officer's demeanor had shifted slightly. He seemed more restless and tense, unable to sit still. The judge noticed the subtle changes and continued to monitor him closely. The witnesses who took the stand next spoke of moments that highlighted courage and fear, adding emotional weight to the case. The officer's reactions were visible to everyone. He clenched his jaw, shifted his weight, and occasionally stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. It was a delicate situation. The courtroom maintained a careful balance of order and vigilance. By the afternoon, the courtroom felt charged with a palpable energy. Everyone sensed that the officer was nearing a breaking point. The tension was not just in his body language, but in the way the audience watched him. Some people leaned forward in their seats, curious and anxious about what might happen next. The media coverage continued to amplify the intensity, spreading updates and speculations. The officer's frustration and the emotional weight of the testimonies created a complex web of tension that everyone could feel. As the day drew to a close, the officer's restlessness remained evident. He seemed to be calculating, thinking through each possibility and reaction. The judge maintained control, keeping the courtroom orderly and ensuring that proceedings continued smoothly. Security remained vigilant, knowing that any sudden move could have serious consequences. The audience watched closely, aware that the story unfolding before them was more than just a trial. It was a moment that would be remembered for years. By the end of the second day, the officer appeared exhausted and emotionally drained. He had listened to detailed accounts of his actions, and the weight of the trial was taking its toll. The judge provided a summary of the day's events, reminding everyone to return the next day and continue the proceedings with the same focus and seriousness. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the tension lingered in the air. Outside, people discussed what had happened, sharing their impressions and concerns. The story of the trial had become a shared experience, capturing the attention and emotions of everyone involved. The second day of the trial had built the foundation for what was coming next. The officer's frustration and tension had become more visible. The courtroom's energy was charged, and everyone sensed that the situation could change dramatically at any moment. The community, the media, and the audience were all engaged, waiting for the next chapter in a story filled with human emotions, challenges, and the unpredictability of events that were about to unfold. The day ended with a sense of anticipation, leaving everyone wondering what would happen when the trial continued, and how the officer would react under the pressure that was mounting all around him. The third day of the trial began with a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang over the courtroom like a heavy cloud. Everyone entering the room could feel that the tension from the previous days had grown stronger. The officer arrived and took his seat, his face a mixture of anxiety and determination. He had spent another night replaying the events of the last 2 days in his mind, and it was clear to anyone watching that the pressure was taking a toll. The audience, the jury, and even the staff could sense that something significant was about to happen. Although no one knew exactly what it would be, the judge entered the courtroom, her calm presence immediately filling the room with a sense of authority. She scanned the audience, the jury, and the officers in attendance, ensuring that everything was in place and that order was maintained. Her gaze briefly met the officer's eyes, and she seemed to silently communicate that the courtroom would remain under her control, no matter what. The trial resumed with the prosecution calling another round of witnesses. These witnesses brought forth accounts that were even more detailed and emotional than before. They described not just events, but the feelings and fears they had experienced during those events. Each testimony added to the tension, and the officer's agitation became more apparent with every word as the witnesses spoke. The officer's behavior started to change subtly at first. He shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers nervously, and occasionally muttered under his breath. His defense attorney leaned over to offer advice, but it was clear that the officer was not fully focused on what was being said. He seemed caught between frustration and a growing sense of panic. The audience could sense the change. The whispers and uneasy glances between people in the courtroom reflected the rising tension. The judge, noticing the officer's restlessness, made mental notes and ensured that the security personnel were alert. The courtroom was a mixture of emotion and observation. Some people felt sympathy for the officer, believing that the pressure of the trial and public scrutiny might be too much for any person to handle. Others were focused on the victims and witnesses, their stories painting a clear picture of the consequences of the officer's actions. Each side of the courtroom seemed to hold its own energy, creating a charged atmosphere that could shift in an instant. The officer's frustration was growing more visible. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and he occasionally looked around the room, almost as if he were searching for a way out or a sign that someone would support him. The prosecution presented more evidence, each piece carefully explained to the jury and audience. Some of it was in the form of documents and reports, while other pieces were photographs and recordings. Each item seemed to weigh on the officer, increasing the intensity of the moment. His body language showed signs of stress. He leaned forward in his chair, rubbed his temples, occasionally shook his head as if trying to dismiss what he was seeing. The judge maintained a composed demeanor, asking clear questions and directing the flow of the trial. Her voice remained calm and measured, stark contrast to the growing tension from the officer. Witness after witness took the stand, sharing stories of fear, confusion, and courage. The jury listened intently, taking in every detail. Some of the audience members were visibly moved by the testimonies, while others remained silent, observing closely. The officer seemed to struggle with each new account, his mind racing with thoughts of defense and denial. His defense attorney whispered advice, but the officer's reactions were limited and distracted. The tension in the room was growing, building toward a moment that everyone could feel was inevitable. Midway through the morning, a particularly emotional witness took the stand. They described an incident in vivid detail, explaining how the officer's actions had directly impacted their life. The courtroom listened in silence, captivated by the story. The officer's agitation increased. He shifted in his seat more frequently, muttered under his breath, and clenched his fists. The defense attorney tried to interject gently, offering reassurance and calm advice, but the officer was already mentally absorbed in his own thoughts. The audience could sense that he was struggling to maintain control. The officer began to fidget more noticeably. He adjusted his jacket repeatedly, glanced around the room, and occasionally locked eyes with the prosecution. His frustration was becoming almost tangible. The judge, observing these signs, maintained her calm demeanor but increased her vigilance. Security officers subtly adjusted their positions, prepared to respond if necessary. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the tension building like a coiled spring, ready to release at any moment. As the day progressed, the officer's inner struggle became increasingly visible. He shifted from leaning forward to leaning back, rubbing his hands on his face, tapping the table with growing impatience. His thoughts seemed scattered, and the courtroom felt the weight of his emotional turmoil. The judge continued to guide the trial with a steady hand, keeping the proceedings on track while subtly monitoring the officer's behavior. The audience remained on edge, fully aware that something significant was about to happen. Witnesses continued to provide detailed accounts, each story adding to the growing pressure on the officer. Some accounts described moments of fear, others highlighted bravery and resilience. The mixture of emotions in the courtroom was almost overwhelming. The officer's frustration reached a point where it was visible to everyone. He leaned back, shook his head, and muttered words that were barely audible, but enough to draw attention. The judge made a note of these signs and maintained control, ensuring that the courtroom remained orderly and safe. During a brief recess, the officer spoke quietly with his attorney. The conversation seemed intense, with the officer gesturing and responding in a mix of frustration and calculation. The attorney offered calm advice, reminding him to stay focused and composed. The officer nodded but seemed only partially attentive. Outside the courtroom, the media continued to cover the trial extensively. Social media and news outlets shared updates, spreading awareness of the tension inside. People discussed what might happen next, speculating about the officer's reactions and the trial's potential outcomes. When the trial resumed, the officer's restlessness was even more noticeable. He shifted constantly, his movements more pronounced, and his focus seemed fragmented. Witnesses continued to speak, some recounting moments of fear and others highlighting acts of courage. Each account added emotional weight, creating a sense of anticipation in the room. The jury listened carefully, balancing the facts with the growing emotional context. The judge continued to guide the proceedings, maintaining a steady presence and ensuring that order was preserved as the day moved forward. The officer's agitation began to manifest in small but significant ways. He muttered under his breath, shot sharp glances at the prosecution, tapped his fingers on the table with increasing intensity. The audience could feel the rising tension, sensing that the officer was nearing a breaking point. The judge maintained a calm and authoritative presence, directing the flow of the trial while subtly monitoring the officer. Security remained vigilant, ready to respond if necessary. By the afternoon, the courtroom was filled with a charged energy. The officer's frustration and the emotional weight of the testimonies created a complex atmosphere. The audience, jury, and staff were all aware that something significant could happen at any moment. The witnesses' accounts continued to build pressure, and the officer's behavior became more unpredictable. The judge's calm demeanor provided a sense of stability, but everyone could feel the tension, escalating toward a pivotal moment. The day ended with the officer visibly exhausted and emotionally drained. His hands trembled slightly as he collected his things. His face showed a mixture of frustration, anxiety, and uncertainty. The judge reminded everyone to return the next day, emphasizing the importance of focus and order. As people left the courtroom, the tension lingered, and the audience outside discussed what had transpired. The story of the trial was unfolding in a way that captured the attention of everyone involved, setting the stage for the dramatic events that were about to occur. The third day of the trial had built the tension to a near breaking point. The officer's frustration and agitation were more visible than ever. The courtroom's energy was charged, and everyone could feel that something significant was about to happen. The stage was set for the next chapter, where the unpredictable nature of human emotion and pressure would lead to a moment that no one would forget. The fourth day of the trial began with a heavy tension that filled every corner of the courtroom. People could feel that the events of the previous days had pushed the trial to a critical point. The officer entered the courtroom looking tense and weary. His eyes scanned the room constantly, and every small noise seemed to heighten his awareness. He sat down in the defendant's area, rubbing his hands together and shifting in his seat. He had spent the night thinking over everything, replaying the testimonies, the evidence, and the reactions from the jury and audience. There was a sense that he was nearing a breaking point. Though no one could predict exactly what would happen, the judge entered the room with her usual calm and composed presence. She walked slowly to her seat, giving the courtroom an unspoken signal that she was in control and that order must be maintained. Everyone fell silent as she took her position. The jury sat forward, focused and alert, understanding the seriousness of the moment. The audience seemed to hold its collective breath, knowing that this could be a pivotal day in the trial. The judge called the courtroom to order and began with the day's proceedings. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every eye on the officer, every ear listening intently to the ongoing testimony. The prosecution presented a critical piece of evidence early in the morning. It was a recording of an incident that had not been played in court before, showing the officer in a high-pressure situation. The room went quiet as the recording played. Voices on the recording revealed intense moments, with the officer's actions under scrutiny. Some members of the audience gasped quietly, while others leaned forward, eyes wide. The jury listened with rapt attention, taking in every word and movement. The officer's reaction was subtle at first, a slight tightening of his jaw and a shift in his posture. He appeared to be mentally processing what he was seeing, though a deep frustration was beginning to show. Witnesses were called to explain the context of the recording. They described the events in vivid detail, providing emotional insight into the moment. Some spoke of fear and uncertainty, while others highlighted bravery and composure under pressure. The officer's agitation grew as the witnesses spoke, his movements more restless and sharp. He rubbed his hands, tapped his fingers on the table, and muttered quietly to himself. His defense attorney tried to calm him, whispering words of reassurance, but the officer was only partially attentive. The courtroom could feel the tension rising, a storm building slowly but surely. As the morning progressed, the officer's agitation became increasingly visible. His gaze shifted from one side of the courtroom to the other, lingering on the prosecution and the jury. He leaned forward in his seat, then quickly leaned back, as if trying to control his impulses. The audience and staff noticed the subtle signs of frustration and anxiety. Even the judge, while calm, kept a close watch on his behavior. The security officers subtly adjusted their positions, aware that the situation required careful monitoring. The tension in the room was palpable, and every movement seemed to carry meaning. A witness described an especially intense moment from the officer's past actions. The story highlighted both fear and courage, painting a complex picture of the situation. The officer's reactions became more pronounced. His hands trembled slightly, his fingers drummed on the table, and he muttered words under his breath that were barely audible, but drew attention. The defense attorney tried to redirect his focus, offering calm and measured advice. The officer nodded, but his eyes betrayed his growing frustration and internal struggle. The audience sensed that something significant was about to unfold, though no one could predict what form it would take. The courtroom was charged with energy, as more details emerged from witnesses. Each story added emotional weight to the case. Some described moments of fear, others highlighted acts of resilience. The officer's agitation grew, his movements becoming sharper and more erratic. His eyes darted around the room, scanning for reactions, perhaps looking for support or a way to regain control. The judge maintained a composed demeanor, speaking calmly and clearly, guiding the proceedings while monitoring the officer's behavior carefully. Security officers remained alert, their presence subtle but reassuring to everyone in the room. As the day moved into the afternoon, the officer's restlessness intensified. He leaned forward, leaned back, shifted from side to side, and tapped his fingers repeatedly. His frustration was clear, though he tried to mask it with brief moments of calm. The judge continued to direct the trial with authority, ensuring that order was maintained. Witnesses continued to speak, each adding more depth to the situation. The jury listened attentively, processing the evidence and testimonies. Understanding that the trial had reached a critical stage, the audience remained on edge, fully aware that something unexpected could happen at any moment. During a particularly emotional testimony, the officer's behavior became more noticeable. He muttered quietly, shook his head, and adjusted his position repeatedly. The courtroom seemed to react subtly to his tension, as if sensing the approaching climax. The judge's calm presence contrasted sharply with the officer's agitation, emphasizing the control and authority she held in the room. The security team subtly moved, preparing for any potential escalation without drawing attention. Every person in the courtroom felt the weight of the moment. Understanding that the trial had reached a turning point, as the testimony concluded, the officer's frustration reached a critical level. He leaned back, took deep breaths, and his hands trembled slightly. The courtroom could feel the rising tension, like a rope being pulled tight. The judge maintained her steady voice, summarizing the testimony and giving instructions to the jury. The officer's defense attorney whispered quietly, trying to help him regain focus, but the officer seemed caught in his own thoughts. The audience watched silently, sensing that the events of the day were leading to something extraordinary. Finally, the moment came when the officer could no longer contain his agitation. A sudden movement, a quick glance, and a tension-filled gesture created a wave of gasps throughout the courtroom. People froze, unsure of what was about to happen. The officer's eyes locked on the judge, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The judge remained calm, her voice firm and measured as she addressed him directly. Security officers, trained and alert, moved subtly, ensuring that the situation could be controlled without chaos. The courtroom was suspended in a state of shock. Aware that the trial had reached a pivotal and unforgettable moment, the officer's realization hit him at the same moment. He understood that the courtroom was prepared for him, that every action he considered was already anticipated and countered. The calm authority of the judge, the preparedness of the security team, and the attentiveness of the jury created an environment that no sudden move could disrupt. Slowly, he lowered his hands, his breathing heavy, and a mix of disbelief and realization crossed his face. The audience released a collective sigh, the tension breaking gradually, but leaving an indelible impression. The day ended with the courtroom restored to order. The officer under control, the story reaching a climax that no one would forget. The fourth day had been a turning point. The tension, the emotional testimonies, and the officer's agitation had built toward a moment that could have been dangerous, but instead highlighted the strength of calm, authority, and preparation. The courtroom, the audience, the jury, and the community witnessed a dramatic yet controlled moment that demonstrated the power of human composure and readiness in the face of extreme tension. The stage was set for the final part of the story, where the aftermath and consequences would unfold, leaving lasting impressions on everyone involved. The final day of the trial began with a mixture of relief and anticipation in the courtroom. After the intense events of the previous day, everyone was aware that the trial was entering its conclusion. People filled the room with an almost solemn focus, aware of the gravity of the moment. The officer arrived, visibly drained from the previous days, his posture tense but subdued. The audience, the jury, and the courtroom staff could all sense that the final outcomes were near and that the culmination of weeks of tension would soon be revealed. The judge entered the room, her calm demeanor setting the tone for the day. She walked to her seat, projecting the same authority and composure that had maintained order throughout the trial. Her eyes briefly met those of the officer, who appeared to understand the full weight of the day's significance. The judge called the courtroom to order and outlined the day's proceedings, emphasizing that fairness, justice, and attention to facts would guide the final moments of the trial. The atmosphere was charged, but the calm leadership of the judge provided a reassuring balance. The prosecution began by summarizing the key evidence and testimonies presented over the past days. They reviewed the accounts of witnesses, highlighting the emotional impact and the gravity of the officer's actions. Each point reinforced the seriousness of the charges and the importance of accountability. The jury listened intently, reviewing the information carefully, understanding that the final decision would have lasting implications. The officer's demeanor was subdued but attentive, and he occasionally shifted in his seat. Clearly processing the implications of what was being presented, the defense attorney made their closing argument. Attempting to contextualize the officer's actions, they spoke calmly, emphasizing that the officer had been under intense pressure, and that certain incidents were misinterpreted or taken out of context. The attorney appealed to the jury's understanding and compassion, trying to highlight mitigating factors that could influence the final judgment. The officer appeared to listen carefully, occasionally nodding, yet his face betrayed concern and reflection on the evidence presented. The courtroom remained silent. Every person absorbed in the proceedings and aware of the moment's gravity. The judge provided instructions to the jury, reminding them of their duty to consider the evidence, testimony, and the law impartially. She emphasized the importance of careful deliberation and the consequences of their decisions. The jury then retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a tense but controlled quiet. The officer remained in the courtroom, quietly observing as the jury left. His thoughts focused on what the verdict could mean for him and his future. The audience, too, felt the weight of the moment, some whispering quietly, others sitting in reflective silence. During the jury's deliberation, the courtroom staff and spectators remained alert and attentive. The officer's attorney spoke quietly to him, offering reassurance and guidance. The officer appeared to take in the words, though his expression suggested deep contemplation. Outside the courtroom, the media and community followed the developments closely, aware that the trial's conclusion could have far-reaching implications. Social media and news outlets provided updates, and discussions flourished about justice, accountability, and the lessons to be learned from the trial. After several hours, the jury returned. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The officer sat with his hands folded, his posture tense but composed. The judge asked the jury foreperson to read the verdict aloud. Every person in the courtroom leaned forward, eyes fixed on the foreperson. The foreperson spoke clearly, detailing the decision based on the evidence and testimonies presented throughout the trial. The words resonated through the room, leaving an impression on all who heard them. The officer's reaction was immediate but controlled. A mixture of relief, disappointment, and contemplation crossed his face. He lowered his gaze, taking in the verdict and reflecting on the events that had led to this moment. His defense attorney whispered quietly, providing support and guidance for what would follow. The judge addressed the courtroom, highlighting the importance of accountability and fairness. She emphasized that the judicial process had been upheld and that everyone's rights and responsibilities had been respected. The courtroom, once tense and chaotic, now seemed to breathe collectively as the gravity of the resolution settled over everyone present. The audience responded quietly, some nodding in understanding, others reflecting on the lessons learned from the trial. The media captured the final moments, documenting the conclusion of a story that had gripped the community for weeks. Witnesses, some visibly emotionally, left the stand with a sense of closure, understanding that their testimonies had contributed to the outcome. The officer was escorted calmly from the courtroom, his demeanor composed yet reflective. Aware of the consequences and the significance of the trial, outside the courtroom, people discussed the verdict, the testimonies, and the dramatic moments of the past days. Community members reflected on the importance of justice, human behavior under pressure, and the impact of individual actions on others. The story of the trial became a lesson in patience, authority, and the importance of composure even in tense situations. The courtroom, the jury, and the judge had all played roles in maintaining order, fairness, and dignity throughout the process. In the days following the trial, the officer faced the consequences of his actions as determined by the legal system. He reflected on his decisions, the moments of frustration and loss of control, and the experiences that had brought him to this point. Community members, media, and observers discussed the trial extensively, analyzing the behaviors, choices, and outcomes. The story became a reminder of the power of calm authority, preparation, and the ability of human beings to navigate extreme tension with composure and fairness. The trial, which had begun with tension and uncertainty, ended with clarity and reflection. Everyone involved, from the officer to the jury, from the witnesses to the audience, had experienced a journey that highlighted human emotion, decision-making, and the consequences of actions. The courtroom, once a place of chaos, became a space where justice and composure prevailed. The lessons learned from the trial, the emotional weight of the testimonies, and the resolution of the case left a lasting impact on all who were involved. The final moments of the trial were marked by quiet reflection, understanding, and the acknowledgement of the importance of accountability. The officer, while facing consequences, experienced the weight of human judgment and the power of a structured, fair system. The judge, jury, and courtroom staff maintained order and dignity, ensuring that the trial concluded with integrity. The audience and community absorbed the lessons, understanding that tension, conflict, and emotional pressure could be met with calmness, preparedness, and thoughtful action. The fifth part of the story brought closure, reflection, and a sense of resolution. The courtroom, the events, and the people involved became part of a larger narrative about human behavior, the importance of justice, and the impact of choices under pressure. The trial ended, leaving a lasting impression on the officer, the witnesses, the jury, and the community. It was a story that would be remembered for years, not just for the dramatic moments, but for the lessons learned about composure, accountability, and the human capacity to navigate challenging situations with dignity and clarity.